Hello and welcome to Macrobytes, the economics and politics podcast from Aberdeen. My name is Luke Bartholomew.
And I'm Lizzy Galbraith.
And this week we are talking about the coming shift in UK politics, where Andy Burnham's return to Westminster following the Makerfield by-election essentially triggered Prime Minister Keir Starmer's resignation, although I suspect it's fair to say that there were a few structural issues before then, and has made it all but certain that Burnham is going to be entering number 10, becoming Prime Minister in coming weeks. And Burnham brings with him not just the possibility of Labour reviving its electoral fortunes, but perhaps also a different governing philosophy, which is sometimes called Manchesterism. But he also faces many of the same constraints as the current soon-to-be previous government, not least very limited fiscal space, and markets, I think, watching his announcement somewhat warily. So today, what we want to talk about is what Burnham's vision of Manchesterism might mean and what it means for the economy and markets.
So before we get into the substance of that question, it's probably worth just going through some of the choreography of the next few months. We are recording this on the 30th of June, and therefore, as Luke mentioned, Andy Burnham is not in number 10, although I think consensus is now pretty settled that he soon will be. So nominations to stand in the technical leadership contest are open until the 15th of July. Andy Burnham is very obviously running in that, and at this stage pretty much everyone else has ruled themselves out. So we're heading towards a coronation rather than a contest, although technically the door is still open for other people to put themselves forward. Now, should there only be a single candidate when nominations close on the 15th, a special leadership conference is then held by the Labour Party on the 17th of July. And that means that Andy Burnham then walks into number 10 on Monday, the 20th of July. You probably start getting cabinet appointments pretty much immediately from that point. So by the end of that week, the new government is essentially going to be up and running. One of the things to note, though, is that by that point, Parliament is actually already on recess. One of the slightly funny things about the fact that we tend to do these sort of shifts in government over the summer is that you don't always get the opportunity to immediately set out your stall before Parliament. You have to do it in a slightly staggered order, and that is essentially what we're going to have this time. So yes, we'll have a cabinet, but they won't actually be able to do all that much straight away, at least. Parliament isn't actually coming back until the 1st of September. It's then sitting for around about 2 weeks, and then they leave again for party conference season between the 15th of September and the 12th of October. So the chances of actual legislative action in that time are pretty slim. Possible that Burnham uses other ways of sort of setting out his stall in the interim, but we're not going to really get Parliament involved until everyone gets back in October from that conference season. Nonetheless, a key moment to watch as we go into that is going to be Burnham's speech at Labour Party conference, and indeed the Chancellor's speech at Labour Party conference. We don't know who they are yet, but those speeches are going to be very carefully watched because they're going to set the tone for the autumn. And what we start thinking about immediately from that point onwards is going to, of course, be the autumn budget, which is going to be of great interest to both us and to markets, probably in November. So in terms of what we then think about cabinet choices, there's a lot of speculation at the moment about whether or not Burnham's going to look to create a big tent cabinet that sort of encapsulates the full breadth of the Labour parliamentary party, bringing in more voices from the wings of the party, particularly on the left, that currently feel a bit underrepresented by Starmer's cabinet, which fairly closely aligns with sort of Starmer's political philosophy, doesn't really delve outside of it too broadly. Markets are mostly interested, as I think we're going to discuss in more detail, about Burnham's Chancellor pick and what that can tell us about his philosophy for government and the tone that will be set over the next 3 years and then and run up to the next general election. And really, you've got two sort of schools of thought. You have the a school of thought that says, well, Andy Burnham is of the soft left, and therefore he should pick a chancellor that closely aligns with his own political philosophy, someone like Ed Miliband, perhaps. Some of his team have been seconded to Burnham's over the by-election campaign, and there are lots of reports that he's been informally advising on policy as well. So there's certainly a degree to which there's conversations happening behind the scenes. That doesn't necessarily mean, of course, that Miliband automatically enters number 11 as a result of those conversations, but there does appear to be a relationship there, and they, of course, go back a very long way, all the way to when Brown and Blair were leading policy. The other school of thought is that you actually want to pick someone that markets are going to be more comforted by, particularly if you have the sort of big reform agenda that potentially you're looking to pull through. Of that ilk, you're maybe looking at a Wes Streeting, an Yvette Cooper, Shabana Mahmood still being mentioned. And that's maybe a different way of sort of squaring the circle of how you bring in all of these different wings of the party into a single government.
So as you say, Lizzy, in the typology of Labour Party political spectrum, Burnham is identified with the soft left. But I think he also wants to go a bit further than that insofar as trying to identify himself with a very particular idiosyncratic political philosophy, this idea of Manchesterism. And I should say that is a label that's been used to talk about a political ideology in the past based around free trade, liberalism, amongst other things. And whatever else Burnham's Manchesterism is, it isn't that. I mean, it isn't yet a fully specified national policy programme. Indeed, part of the clue in the name is that it is very much rooted in a particular place, Manchester, and Burnham's time as as mayor of Manchester. But it does, I think, come with some ideas about how governing at a national level should be done. More power out of Whitehall, more public direction of essential infrastructure, more willingness to coordinate public and private capital together. Burnham himself has talked about it being rooted in devolution, long-term planning and good growth, which is a very interesting phrase which we might come back to. But some of the specifics around that as it related to his time as mayor of Manchester involve things like power to integrate the local transport network, extra power over housing and skills, the ability to push through the development of industrial clusters, which Burnham argues added to the attractiveness of Manchester as a place to deploy capital and was responsible for some of the relative revival of Manchester's fortunes over recent years. And I suppose the other thing to say is, as with all political ideologies, I suppose, at some level there is a degree of branding, vibes, signalling about it as well. And in this case, what it's trying to signal very much is that it's not Westminster that's leading the growth or the governing strategy. So, at the same time, it's a growth model, it's a governance model, and it's a political brand. But I suppose from our perspective, from the perspective of this podcast, what we're most interested in is the question of it as a growth model, whether this is a credible growth strategy for the UK. And I think maybe the place to start in thinking about that question is around devolution, because as we talked about, that probably is the heart of the agenda such as it is. Burnham used his recent speeches to call for a rapid acceleration in devolution in the UK, and the fundamental diagnosis that Burnham brings with him to Downing Street is the idea that the UK's growth model is too London-centric and too centralised. And that's not a new argument. Many governments have been making that for quite a long time. And indeed, of course, it was George Osborne, Chancellor in a previous Conservative government, who was responsible for the devolution that led to the development of the mayoralty, which Burnham held in Manchester. But the fact there that I talked about what Burnham brings to Downing Street is itself perhaps Burnham's telling part of the issue. And indeed, one way in which he wants to break this sense of London-centricness to our politics is to develop this so-called new number 10 of the North, a very visible symbol of devolution, and that would involve part of the Downing Street operation moving up to Manchester. It would be given a very specific mission around equalising living standards across Britain, reforming essential utilities, and boosting reindustrialisation and the regeneration of place. So, it's, I suppose, political rewiring done from the centre as a symbol of devolution.
Yeah, at the moment, it almost feels like the vibe of what Burnham is trying to go for at the moment feels like a bit of a mashup of sort of Cool Britannia meets Levelling Up. But to be clear, there are lots of questions on the detail. Burnham so far has been very much setting out a sort of a broad brush vision for how he would like the time in his time in office to go, how he would like to see the UK economy evolve. But there are lots of questions, in particular about which powers his government actually plans to devolve to whom. Are all of these regional mayoralties actually similarly equipped to be able to take on all of these powers? Are they going to be able to take advantage of those powers in ways that Greater Manchester did? Or is that a success story that is actually harder to replicate when you get down to, the particular regional variances across the UK? And indeed, how quickly can any of that happen? There's only 3 years until the next general election. Burnham's talking about a growth plan that actually is a 10-year vision. We don't have necessarily all that long before voters would actually have to cast a judgment as to whether or not enough progress has been made to allow him to keep going with whatever that vision is at that point. And it's also something that I think, as you mentioned, Luke, previous governments have been thinking about and doing things about for a very long time. This concept of the UK being too centralised is not a new one. Most governments of sort of recent years have attempted to address this in one form or another. You mentioned George Osborne, who is the reason that Andy Burnham could take on that mayoral role, first of all. I've just mentioned Boris Johnson's levelling up agenda, and Rachel Reeves announced in her May's lecture this spring that the Treasury was working on a plan to give regions a share of income tax raised in their areas to give them greater autonomy over spending in their regions as well. So this is something that is not necessarily a new philosophy. It's certainly a more expansive way of thinking about it, a more ambitious way of thinking about how devolution can work in the UK. But we don't have a huge amount of clarity on exactly how this is going to work and how quickly you can move towards this type of model. And on that point, a huge absence from Burnham's plan so far has been detail on fiscal policy. How are you going to fund all of this? How are you going to redistribute your taxation revenue across the country to allow for some of these plans to actually be fulfilled? And the fiscal inheritance that Burnham will take on is a binding one. Reeves's fiscal rules are going to remain in place. Burnham has already confirmed that. And he's also confirmed that he's going to take on the manifesto pledges around tax that Reeves has committed to as well. That leaves you with very limited scope for a large fiscal expansion that would allow you to fund some of these policies or proposals at this stage. So tax rises rather than borrowing has to be the mechanism while these fiscal rules remain in place. So regardless of what happens with this vision, in the short term, we are still looking at probably a tax raising budget in the autumn, possibly not enough fiscal space to actually be able to commit to the grand sweep of these plans in the short term either, given the constraints that the government is under. Burnham also probably wants to undo some of the changes that Reeves made, given their unpopularity with both the Labour Party and actually the wider public. It's possible that we see national insurance looked at again. It's possible that we see the planned departmental spending cuts that Reeves has penciled in looked at again. We've been arguing for a long time, Luke, that we don't think those are necessarily viable either practically or politically, and this might be a chance for some new faces to come in and make some changes there. But there are, I think, some ways in which you can sort of shift existing money around to would maybe allow you to do some of these things in the short term, or at least move towards them. So Andy Burnham's very, very keen to see quite a significant increase in council house building. There is already an affordable housing fund sort of sat there that has been carved out by Rachel Reeves. It's £39 billion worth. You could conceivably channel what is left in that fund entirely into council housing rather than spreading it between council and affordable homes. And that would allow you to maybe make a start on some of these commitments. But there is a tricky fiscal inheritance, and it does mean that you're going to come up quite quickly against the practical constraints of whether you can deliver the scope of the ambition that you've set out in that sort of short time frame.
And then the other thing to say, Lizzy, about some of those things you were talking about there, housing and potentially welfare reform, and how it relates to the potential success of Manchesterism as a growth strategy, is that we shouldn't necessarily take it for granted that Burnham's diagnosis of the problem is absolutely necessarily the right one in terms of what the fundamental cause of Britain's growth problems are. In some senses, the weakness of UK growth over the last 15 or years feels over-determined. There are plenty of factors, and maybe political centralisation plays a role in that. But I think most economists would think questions of planning and the related delivery of housing and infrastructure, energy costs, regulation and welfare, perhaps capital market functioning are actually much more important than this question of devolution and the way in which government is administered more from the centre or more locally. And, there could be very good other reasons to pursue localisation and devolution. You might be committed to that for other political reasons which are perfectly good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it follows that it's good for growth. And indeed, I think that's why I picked up on that phrase that Burnham mentioned of good growth and wanting to prioritise that. That hardly speaks of someone who is out to maximise economic growth per se and is looking for every opportunity to deliver economic growth. It's a very particular kind of growth that he wants. And you might wonder whether the UK is in a position to be that picky about the kind of growth that it gets. Now, there is a much more optimistic take on the devolution agenda, and you might think that some of those other reforms that I said were more important could be downstream of devolution. You get the governing system right, the devolution right, and you can unlock some of those other reforms. So perhaps welfare that's administered at a more local level, reflecting local labour markets, or we get better at getting people back to work. That's definitely one idea that seems to be swirling in the Burnham camp. Perhaps planning reform will be easier done if it's done at the local level, especially if those localities can keep some of the upside of the growth that comes from that planning. But I would also note that, for the success, and this is going to sound trivial, but I promise that it has a slightly deeper point, but for the success of any medium-term strategy to pay off, you have to get through the short term. And what I mean by that, well, it might be that Burnham also has to ensure that his plans have the confidence of financial markets in the near term so that they get the chance to potentially pay dividends over the long run. After all, Liz Truss would say of herself and her government that it had an ambitious supply side agenda, albeit, of a very different political valence and a set of prescriptions that she offered, but, in her own terms, an ambitious agenda, but that never got the chance to play out. We never got a chance to see whether that would deliver the kind of things that she and her government claimed it would, because it got derailed by a gilt market sell-off by fiscal sustainability concerns. So for these long-term projects to pay off, you do have to have that short-term credibility. And the reason that that is a point worth making around Burnham is that there have been times where that has felt a little bit more up in the air, the sense in which markets did have confidence in him. Obviously, he'd made comments in the past about policy perhaps being too in hoc to the gilt market. There were various surveys floating around at points suggesting that bond market investors were most concerned about Burnham becoming Prime Minister, and the gilt market has been relatively high volatility recently, reflecting some of those political concerns. Now, I think most recently, Burnham has gone a long way to reducing fears about what he might be. He's committed to the current fiscal rules. He's brought in some economic advisors that are meant to signal credibility. But even if those concerns about the fiscal rules have faded, and he's bought time and reassured markets, for now, as you say, Lizzy, the fiscal fundamentals, growth, spending, tax policy, the gilt market itself, remain very, very challenging. And I suppose one place where that challenging fiscal position is binding around some of the agenda that Burnham might have if he was in a more unconstrained position would be around things like public ownership of utilities. And in absence of being able to take things into outright public ownership, I think we're likely to see, more regulatory changes. I mean, Burnham has talked about increasing public control in utilities rather than public ownership as part of a 10-year plan to lower bills. And I think the model for that is around the Greater Manchester bus service, where private operators were still allowed to run services, but public authorities controlled the routes, the fares, integration into the wider transport system. And something like that might be what Burnham has in mind for utilities more generally across the country. But it is still a bit vague at present about how this model would work. But nonetheless, it probably is going to be one of his defining policy tests. Can he deliver the lower bills and stronger accountability that he promises such a model would deliver, without in turn perhaps undermining the private capital, the investment which is badly needed in things like water, energy and transport?
And I think that's actually the crux of how the medium-term picture for the UK is really going to be built. Can Burnham actually meet some of these policy tests that he's setting out? Arguably, the collapse of the Starmer government has come because the public feels that he has not delivered on the policy pledges that he made in the run-up to the 2024 election, and that has allowed, via the sort of the wider fracturing in the UK political space, reform to sort of come through the gap. And this is partly a story of the Labour Party becoming increasingly concerned about its electoral prospects at the next election, and particularly the prospects of a reform-led government, unless polling substantially changes from here. And it was felt that that was not going to be possible under Starmer, and might possibly be an achievement that Burnham could pull off. In Makerfield, it is worth noting that he beat reform pretty decisively in the end. He polls far better among sort of wavering Labour voters than Starmer has done for a very long time. And Burnham's pitch is very much designed to appeal to those economically disaffected voters that are kind of your exact sweet spot between your sort of Labour, swithering Labour voters that are possible reform defectors. It's a very much a story of kind of local pride, focus on affordability, public control, place-based politics, that can theoretically appeal quite strongly to voters that do feel that Westminster doesn't really serve them or their constituencies anymore. And that could conceivably help shore up Labour, particularly in the North and the Midlands, sort of what we used to call the Red Wall, then became the Blue Wall, sort of red again, maybe sort of tealish going forwards. It's certainly not a safe environment for Labour. They are trying to shore up their support there at the moment. And this feels like a policy platform that is designed with that in mind. But it creates risks on the other side. It creates policy risks around how you're viewed by more centrist voters that maybe have concerns about phrases like public control. It equally maybe creates concerns among businesses and investors who might have similar concerns about what type of public control Burnham is talking about, and what that means for things like taxes and how effectively these services are going to be run going forward. Whether or not you can, as you said, still attract investment into those services, which of course they need. So I think there's very much a balancing act that Burnham is going to have to strike here if he's going to be successful in shoring up Labour's support, creating an electoral coalition that can help it withstand the next election, and keeping markets and businesses on side, avoiding the kind of political volatility that actually appears to have hurt business sentiment and consumer sentiment over the past 18 months or so. So it's a pretty tall ask. The delivery risk here is actually really quite high. But there is the sort of the beginnings of a plan here for a very complex multi-year reform programme. It could appear to be really quite transformational if it actually starts bearing fruit, and if Burnham comes in and actually pushes forward this agenda with the kind of purpose that I think he's started to hint at, but it's always quite easy to sort of say these things before you've actually entered number 10. Many governments sound like they're going to do a lot and then end up slowing things down immediately on contact. So we shall wait and see. But where does that leave us now? Andy Burnham is, of course, still not in number 10. Manchesterism is an evolving policy position, probably best understood as the political economy of devolution, public-private coordination, and hopefully visible local delivery. That's going to be the key, I think, when we're talking about how voters end up feeling about this as a platform for government. There is potential growth upside here, not necessarily from, as you've said, Luke, the devolution itself, but possibly from what it can unlock further down the line. And certainly we're looking at a government that is very different in political style, more direct, more place-based, probably more interventionist as well, and more focused, I think, on what voters would consider the essentials, so bills, transport, housing, rather than kind of these more kind of conceptual ideas like Starmer talks about, your sort of values-based government. This feels like a more practical type of policy making. But the big macro constraints are not going anywhere. The UK still has limited fiscal space, it still has weak productivity growth, high public service demand, and a market environment that is very sensitive to any perception of fiscal slippage. That is going to limit the ability of this incoming government to deliver on its ambitions. So the test for Burnham is going to be whether he can deliver enough in that short space of time until the next election to keep his party on side, keep voters on side, and demonstrate enough delivery to be able to keep going into the next parliament. That is all we have time for today. The podcast is going to be taking a break over the summer, and we're going to be back in mid-August, just in time to cast judgment on Burnham's first month in office and see whether or not the plans that he set out are in motion. As always, please like and subscribe. It really helps us, and hope you all have a good summer.
This podcast is provided for general information only and assumes a certain level of knowledge of financial markets. It is provided for information purposes only and should not be considered as an offer, investment, recommendation, or solicitation to deal in any of the investments or products mentioned herein, and does not constitute investment research. The views in this podcast are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily reflect those of Aberdeen. The value of investments and the income from them can go down as well as up, and investors may get back less than the amount invested. Past performance is not a guide to future returns, return projections, or estimates, and provide no guarantee of future results.